Good evening. This is a WBAU special report. President Nixon is about to make a speech to the nation at approximately 9 p.m. this evening. That's in about 9 minutes from now. I'm Mike Kane for WBAU News. In the studio with me this evening are Clark Howard, Ira Sitzer, Ira Salwin, and Joanne Ventura, along with Alan Goldwasser of the WBAU News staff. The president and his family have gathered for his last hours in the world's most powerful post of leadership. Tonight at 9 p.m., President Nixon is expected to resign. The word from the family quarters is that they're taking it hard. If you could see their faces, said one aide trailing off. There's no cheering outside the White House either, not even from the Nixon foes. Not that it's going to be over pretty soon. All day, crowds have gathered there to watch and wait in silence. A White House source says Nixon will not attend the expected swear-in of Vice President Gerald Ford tomorrow afternoon or evening. That source says that Nixon, who rode a landslide victory 2 years ago, intends to leave the White House while he's still president. The Nixon family will board the presidential Air Force jet, the Spirit of 76, for the last time tomorrow morning. They'll fly to their home in San Clemente, California, no longer to be known as the Western White House. While the president prepared his surrender to the inevitable today, the man who will find the burdens of that office thrust into him tomorrow scanned a list of 14 names. Suggestions for the post Gerald Ford himself has held since another scandal forced Spiro Agnew out of office. The list was handed to Ford by a group of conservative Republican senators, and it doesn't include the name of New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, said to be Ford's current top choice. Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater tops that list, and such names as Senators James Buckley, William Brock, Howard Baker, and Ronald Reagan are on it too. Ford hasn't commented or chosen, and presumably he will not until he has been sworn into the White House tomorrow. Meanwhile, Rockefeller has scheduled a news conference for tomorrow night. I'd like to ask at this moment Clark Howard to reflect for just a moment on what has happened. There's been a tremendous amount of discussion as to whether the president should take any one of the alternatives open to him. He can resign, which is the word we have right now this evening, or he can take the 25th Amendment, which allows him to step down temporarily and continue holding the title. And that would mean turning his duties over to Gerald Ford on a temporary basis. It doesn't seem as though that's going to be the case, because we have unconfirmed reports in Washington that say that President Nixon will formally resign in a letter to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger tomorrow morning. That's from a reliable congressional source saying that Vice President Gerald Ford will be sworn in at noon Eastern Daylight Time tomorrow. Clark, what do you think about the president's alternatives? Do you think he should have gone through a Senate trial if it came to that?
For a while, I was really convinced that that was the direction in which he was heading, and it amazes me that he has come to this conclusion as swiftly as he had. I truly believe that he had not even considered resignation, as he said, and I think that's absolutely true, that it did not even enter his mind until within the last few days. And something of that magnitude to grapple with and come to a decision all within a 72-hour period, or some such period of that, is the most amazing part about it to me. And I think in a few months it'll seem even more amazing, and perhaps a few answers to that will unfold. We, of course, will not be aware for some time of what the other implications of Mr. Nixon leaving office in this way at this time will be, and there certainly are many that people haven't even delved into yet and won't even be realized for several months.
Well, the president's speechwriters were drawing up a resignation speech as a contingency, and they've been doing that since Monday evening. It was reported that the president reached the decision either early this morning or late last night. As you'll remember, last evening he had a meeting with several Republican senators, top Republican senators, Senator Barry Goldwater among them, and they came out of that meeting saying that the president was aware that the situation was grim on Capitol Hill, but there was no decision at that point. And earlier, it had been said by White House aides that the president was going to fight. That was yesterday. During yesterday afternoon, if you remember, two newspapers, one in Memphis, Tennessee, had reported that the president had decided to resign. And we later learned that that was a little premature speculation on what the president intended to do. However, with the upcoming speech in about 4 minutes from now, we may find out that that indeed is the case. WBAU is covering this speech live, as I said before, through the courtesy of WFUV Radio and the ABC Radio Network. Ira Solomon, one of the big questions now, I guess, is since it's fairly evident that Gerald Ford will become the next president of the United States, the 38th, there's a lot of speculation as to who he will choose as a vice president. There are a number of names on the list, as we said before. Barry Goldwater, Nelson Rockefeller. James Buckley is even announced as a possibility. Who would you say that Jerry Ford, is just speculation, would be likely to choose?
Well, there have been reports to the effect that
Well, let's put it this way. It has been said that Nelson Rockefeller has been taken off that list. Now, the reason for that, I would say, is that Rockefeller would not be accepted by conservative Republicans.
That's, I would say, a possibility. One of the things I think that you have to, at this point, take into account is that Gerald Ford has a great many friends in Congress. I think that this is one of the things that will probably work in his favor. The fact that although he is assuming the duties of the executive branch after a very short time in that branch, and he will be chief executive, he has a great many friends in Congress, and I think that if he really made it known to his friends on Capitol Hill that he had a definite choice of Nelson Rockefeller or of Barry Goldwater or any of these other gentlemen, that this would probably sit fairly well with most of the people who are influential up on the Hill. I think that Howard Baker is another possible choice. Barry Goldwater tops the list probably because of the fact that Goldwater, since his 1964 defeat, the record landslide win for Lyndon Johnson, has emerged over a period of time as sort of a dean of the Senate Republicans. I think somewhat in the way that Richard Nixon managed to make a political comeback and appear to be much more apolitical as time went on, and then of course he managed to grab the presidency for himself. I don't think Ronald Reagan is, I think that for the same reason that Nelson Rockefeller might be very unpalatable to conservatives, I think that Ronald Reagan would just really not sit well at all with many of the liberals on Capitol Hill and in the Republican Party, and I think that people like Charles Percy and so on are a force to be reckoned with. That I think Mr. Ford realizes that he's going to have a run for the money for the nomination, assuming that he wants it in '76, and that Percy, I would say, would be one of the liberal front runners, and he's got to keep that wing of the party happy.
Okay, it should be mentioned that Vice President Ford held a long meeting with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger today and later issued a statement saying the present policy was in the best interest of the United States. Kissinger is expected to remain as Secretary of State. The speech of the President is coming up in just about a minute's time from now. He is to address the nation from the Oval Office of the White House, where there has been a tremendous amount of activity in and around the White House. There are a number of people gathered outside to take in this piece of history, and we will be switching shortly to the ABC Radio Network.
Mike, I think a speech of this nature, of such an unprecedented nature, will be very interesting to watch the usually composed and serene Mr. Nixon in his crisis.
Okay, the speech is coming up. Here is the President of the United States. They are still preparing. The president should be ready to speak any moment now. He will be speaking from the Oval Office. And as we have said, Vice President Ford should have a statement for the American people via television and radio, possibly tomorrow night. If indeed the president resigns this evening, Gerald Ford will be, here is the President of the United States.
37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. As long as there was such a base, I felt strongly that it was necessary to see the constitutional process through to its conclusion, that to do otherwise would be unfaithful to the spirit of that deliberately difficult process and a dangerously destabilizing precedent for the future. But with the disappearance of that base, I now believe that the constitutional purpose has been served, and there is no longer a need for the process to be prolonged. I would have preferred to carry through to the finish, whatever the personal agony it would have involved. And my family unanimously urged me to do so. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office. As I recall the high hopes for America with which we began this second term, I feel a great sadness that I will not be here in this office working on your behalf to achieve those hopes in the next 2.5 years. But in turning over direction of the government to Vice President Ford, I know, as I told the nation when I nominated him for that office 10 months ago, that the leadership of America will be in good hands. In passing this office to the Vice President, I also do so with a profound sense of the weight of responsibility that will fall on his shoulders tomorrow, and therefore of the understanding, the patience, the cooperation he will need from all Americans. As he assumes that responsibility, he will deserve the help and the support of all of us. As we look to the future, the first essential is to begin healing the wounds of this nation, to put the bitterness and divisions of the recent past behind us, and to rediscover those shared ideals that lie at the heart of our strength and unity as a great and as a free people. By taking this action, I hope that I will have hastened the start of that process of healing which is so desperately needed in America. I regret deeply any injuries that may have been done in the course of the events that led to this decision. I would say only that if some of my judgments were wrong, and some were wrong, they were made in what I believed at the time to be the best interest of the nation. To those who have stood with me during these past difficult months, to my family, my friends, to many others who joined in supporting my cause because they believed it was right, I will be eternally grateful for your support. And to those who have not felt able to give me your support, let me say, I leave with no bitterness toward those who have opposed me. Because all of us in the final analysis have been concerned with the good of the country, however our judgments might differ. So let us all now join together in affirming that common commitment and in helping our new president succeed for the benefit of all Americans. I shall leave this office with regret at not completing my term, but with gratitude for the privilege of serving as your president for the past 5.5 years. These years have been a momentous time in the history of our nation and the world. They have been a time of achievement in which we can all be proud, achievements that represent the shared efforts of the administration, the Congress, and the people. But the challenges ahead are equally great, and they too will require the support and the efforts of the Congress and the people working in cooperation with the new administration. We have ended America's longest war, but in the work of securing a lasting peace in the world, the goals ahead are even more far-reaching and more difficult. We must complete a structure of peace so that it will be said of this generation, our generation of Americans, by the people of all nations, not only that we ended one war, but that we prevented future wars. We have unlocked the doors that for a quarter of a century stood between the United States and the People's Republic of China. We must now ensure that the 1/4 of the world's people who live in the People's Republic of China will be and remain not our enemies, but our friends. In the Middle East, 100 million people in the Arab countries, many of whom have considered us their enemy for nearly 20 years, now look on us as their friends. We must continue to build on that friendship so that peace can settle at last over the Middle East, and so that the cradle of civilization will not become its grave. Together with the Soviet Union, we have made the crucial breakthroughs that have begun the process of limiting nuclear arms. But we must set as our goal not just limiting, but reducing and finally destroying these terrible weapons so that they cannot destroy civilization, and so that the threat of nuclear war will no longer hang over the world and the people. we have opened a new relation with the Soviet Union. We must continue to develop and expand that new relationship so that the two strongest nations of the world will live together in cooperation rather than confrontation. Around the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, there are millions of people who live in terrible poverty, even starvation. We must keep as our goal turning away from production for war and expanding production for peace, so that people everywhere on this earth can at last look forward in their children's time, if not in our own time, to having the necessities for a decent life. Here in America, we are fortunate that most of our people have not only the blessings of liberty, but also the means to live full and good, and by the world's standards, even abundant lives. We must press on, however, toward a goal not only of more and better jobs, but of full opportunity for every American. And of what we are striving so hard right now to achieve, prosperity without inflation. For more than a quarter of a century in public life, I have shared in the turbulent history of this era. I have fought for what I believed in. I have tried, to the best of my ability, to discharge those duties and meet those responsibilities that were entrusted to me. Sometimes I have succeeded, and sometimes I have failed. But always, I have taken heart from what Theodore Roosevelt once said about the man in the arena whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, because there is not effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deed, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumphs of high achievements, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. I pledge to you tonight that as long as I have a breath of life in my body, I shall continue in that spirit. I shall continue to work for the great causes to which I have been dedicated throughout my years as a congressman, a senator, vice president, and president. The cause of peace, not just for America, but among all nations. Prosperity, justice, and opportunity for all of our people. There is one cause, above all, to which I have been devoted, and to which I shall always be devoted for as long as I live. When I first took the oath of office as president 5.5 years ago, I made this sacred commitment to consecrate my office, my energies, and all the wisdom I can summon to the cause of peace among nations. I've done my very best in all the days since to be true to that pledge. As a result of these efforts, I am confident that the world is a safer place today, not only for the people of America, but for the people of all nations. And that all of our children have a better chance than before of living in peace rather than dying in war. This, more than anything, is what I hoped to achieve when I sought the presidency. This, more than anything, is what I hope will be my legacy. to you, to our country, as I leave the presidency. To have served in this office is to have felt a very personal sense of kinship with each and every American. In leaving it, I do so with this prayer. May God's grace be with you in all the days ahead.
You have been listening to a speech and address from the Oval Office of the White House by President Richard Nixon. I'm Mike Kane for WBAU News, and in the studio once again with me are Alan Goldwasser, Clark Howard, Ira Sitzer, Ira Salwin, Joanne Ventura, and Joan Goldstein. The President said that he will resign, and it will take effect tomorrow at noon. And he said the reasons were that he has had little political support of late, and that he sees no need to lengthen the continuation of the impeachment proceedings and to drag the country through that process. The President said, though, that he's not a quitter, and that the President will not, as I said, put the nation through that process. He says there's a need now for healing, and he admits to some poor judgment. The President said he shall continue to work for the causes of peace and prosperity, but the surprise, I guess, of this entire address was that the President did not admit, as prior speculation had it he might, that he had any guilt in the Watergate cover-up situation. Let me turn a question now to Joanne Ventura. Joanne, were you surprised at all by the President's lack of any mention of guilt in the Watergate cover-up?
Well, I thought most certainly, due to the fact that the whole incident, the whole impeachment question was based on his involvement or non-involvement, per se, in the Watergate situation, that he would have had something to say about it. However, what surprised me even more was the fact that during his whole speech, the tone was more in what can we do for the world, what's the world about. He seemed to sorely neglect that there was a nation here that was trying him to see his faults, because the rest of the world didn't see. They only saw the good in what was going on. But however, as time progressed, they found out, brought the American public, and no doubt they will know our dirty laundry now, which might be good or bad, I can't really say. But the fact that he stuck so much to what he had done was no surprise. And I guess the only things he had really done in his own mind were what had happened in Vietnam, whether it was going to end because of him or because of somebody else, or his trip to China or Russia. These are the two things. He wanted to go out on in his own mind, a positive note. He tried in his very best manner to get across in that way to us that he had done something and that his guilt should not be put in the forefront. Also, whatever consequences are going to come out of this wasn't brought about, and that's open for much debate. And I turn that over to the floor, I guess, whoever...
Well, that certainly is a big question. Where will the political process go from here, and how will this change the political aspects of the American presidency? Ira Sitzer has some thoughts on that. Ira?
Yeah, well, I agree with Joanne. The speech was basically one of trying to unify the country rather than the ill-fated speech in California many years ago. But the content left a lot of questions open. The president said that he resigned due to a lack of a political base in Congress. Now, the question will immediately rise as to whether he resigned because Congress was out to get him on a witch hunt. At no time did the president admit any conscious wrongdoing or any violation of any law whatsoever. I think the speech will lead to charges that the thing was a witch hunt. It should also tie up Congress with the question of further proceedings, both with regards to impeachment and criminal prosecution, since the president's total role has not been revealed, at least not to the public. The Watergate mess is not over, I don't think, not for a while. Congress has to come to a conclusion as to just what it can do, and for that matter, the special prosecutor has to decide what he's going to do, what action he will or will not take. If he does take action, it will make an interesting spectacle to see the President of the United States undergoing criminal prosecution. If he does not take any action, it will be the target of some interesting comments as to whether there is truly equal justice under the law.
Well, Congress has been talking of late about granting the presidency immunity from prosecution, that being criminal prosecution. There's been a lot of discussion about that during the day today, and before the president made his speech, they were pretty well set on that. Alan Goldwasser, you have some details on congressional legislation and the president's situation.
Yes, I do, Mike. As early as 11 o'clock this morning, Senator Edward Brooke from Massachusetts, he is a Republican, he introduced a resolution urging that Nixon not be prosecuted if he resigns. Such a resolution would not have the force of the law. Nixon's chief speechwriter, Ray Price, was directed to prepare this speech for delivery to the nation tonight. Trying to use this, this particular thing was done before he, just as Nixon was meeting with Ford to discuss matters. And Ray Price, supposedly, although he had been given several days to work on the speech, again, supposedly, was not near completion until who knows when, but certainly toward the evening. Enough time to give Nixon time to read it over, but at least time for him to see what people thought about him. For example, Brooke bringing this resolution to pass. Brooke did say that several senators agreed with him and they had his support, but still others he spoke to were on the opposing fence.
But Alan, there's one important distinction that you're not making there. Brooke said he would vote against his own bill that he introduced this morning if President Nixon did not admit some guilt involving the Watergate cover-up.
That indeed is the case,
and
yes. I'd heard that
he
Senator
admitted
Brooke had said
none
that.
whatsoever, so I should be, if Senator Brooke means what he said this morning after he introduced that bill, he should have completely the opposite attitude about it now.
There was also a tremendous question as to whether the legislature has any power whatsoever to pardon. Some constitutional experts made the comment that they feel only the president has the pardon power, which would mean in this case, I suppose, President Ford.
Well, they do say that this resolution would not have the force of the law. It's sort of a recommendation as the Congress might choose to censure someone.
Senator Byrd said earlier today that he was hoping that the president in his speech this evening would admit to some guilt in the Watergate cover-up. Had that been the case, which it seems is evident at this point. One thing that I think an interesting point that we've failed to mention thus far has been that the president has the power under the Constitution to grant himself immunity. Now, this is something that the president has not mentioned as a possibility, and there's also the possibility that the new president, that being Gerald Ford, as of tomorrow afternoon, can grant Richard Nixon immunity from prosecution. However, in the hearings for his appointment, he said during those hearings that would be highly inappropriate and that the American people wouldn't stand for such a thing. Ira Salwin, you have some thoughts on this.
Well, on the matter of a pardon, I think that one of the things that should be considered is the fact that until now the president has been criticized by some for not standing up for some of his associates, former associates, who have been sentenced for various crimes and so on, stemming from the Watergate break-in originally. And I think that one of the things that would be probably a little bit less untenable for the president would be to grant, in his closing hours, would be to grant pardons to those men who have been sentenced, Colson and so on. Although the question still would remain of whether he could do that and expect any sort of a break from Congress and from, President-to-be Ford and so on. I think one of the things in examining the speech, in trying to imagine what it would be like before it happened, I couldn't conceive of how Richard Nixon, remembering his character and his entire political career, I didn't know how Richard Nixon would get on the tube in front of the entire nation and admit his guilt in the Watergate cover-up. And I think that the speech itself, the way that it was structured and so on, was very indicative of the president's character. I think that he dwelt on foreign policy, and he talked about his legacy, something which he's always shown great concern with, his place in history. And I think that that was probably an attempt to leave the American people with a feeling that that although there have been some terrible things that have happened, I think that history will judge me to have been a great president, at least in the foreign policy realm, and he enumerated some of his accomplishments. I think that he invoked the word of Theodore Roosevelt, a former president, and also, of course, at the end, closing with a prayer, invoking the will of God for the future of the United States. And the other thing that, the two words I believe that that will be very much talked about from this speech was when he talked about sparing the country the ordeal of a long fight for his personal vindication. I believe those were the words that he used. And I think that there are going to be a great many voices on Capitol Hill that are going to take those two words and say that this was Richard Nixon's way of telling the American people that he could have been vindicated, that he was innocent, and that for reasons other than the Watergate mess and his own involvement, he is stepping down, and the reasons, of course, that he enumerated were because of an erosion of political support, not because of anything that he did, but because of the actions of others who are now declining to support him. I think the one thing that's certain from the speech is that he didn't leave anybody else any easy ways out. There's going to be a great deal of discussion in Congress about what to do now. We've gone this far with impeachment. Where do we go from here? I think there's going to be a great deal of discussion among the president's constituency, which still numbers 12, 15 million people in the United States, are still very much in support of the president. And from all indications, they've been calling the White House and been very emotional. Not the president shouldn't give up, the president shouldn't resign. And I think that if you have a hardcore of people that are going to be very, very dissatisfied, that the implications of that for the future of the presidency, the immediate future of our country, and of course of a Ford administration, are going to be tremendous.
Well, I'd like to add that possibly what he's overlooked in his whole speech was the fact that in saying that the Congress has given him no confidence to go on, so to say, and whatever, he is using a political approach to a very legal problem. Now, what's going to come out of that is up for debate.
Well, that is indeed up for debate, and Mr. Nixon may be getting himself into more trouble than he realizes because, on the one hand, they have the question of whether to proceed with the impeachment proceedings, which I think will quickly dissolve because of the mere fact that they are pointless, and a basic legal premise is that if there is nothing to be gained by proceeding, then you don't proceed. There's often...
Well, Clark, I think the distinction has to be made that the impeachment proceedings are a political proceeding, and that you're indicating that perhaps criminal proceedings may now begin to develop because of the President's statements this evening.
Yes, I'm making the distinction from the fact that Mr. Nixon, up until now, has had his fate in the hands of Congress, and now he will be throwing it to the fate of professional prosecutors, and whose job it is all the time to prosecute people who have violated the laws of the United States and the various states thereof. And so I think that he has perhaps ill-considered the fact that he will be placing himself in greater jeopardy by risking prosecution, especially not taking on any admission of guilt by his speech. And indeed, even if the Senate was impressed enough to continue with the Brooke measure of sense of Congress saying that the president should not be prosecuted, that even would not hold any weight with anyone because Congress has not the power to legislate something like that. They can only recommend. So that the president, as Ira mentioned earlier, Ira Sitzer, that is, may very well still be very much in the public eye as a result of Watergate from now on, in spite of his decision tonight.
Well, his fate at this point seems to be completely up to the special prosecutor. I cannot see Mr. Jaworski with his past record of not really prosecuting that strongly people who are willing to give up their offices, such as Mr. Agnew, for example. I can't see Mr. Jaworski pushing, it's trying to get Mr. Nixon put in jail, but I can see Mr. Jaworski trying to bring out as many facts as are possible.
Well, just incidentally, the president is going to get terrifically involved in trials of people still pending out of this order. He can no longer use executive privilege to exempt himself from subpoenas to testify in behalf or against individuals still facing criminal charges as a result of the Watergate, and he will then be, of course, under oath giving whatever testimony he has to give.
He may not have to give any, since he is now under the protection of the Fifth Amendment, should he so choose to use it.
That is true, too.
What about the possibility that that the president may have or possibly has in the wind a deal of the sort that Vice President Agnew managed to make? As Ira mentioned, Mr. Jaworski has shown a disposition toward plea bargaining and so on, more of an interest in the facts than in the prosecution of these cases. What about the possibility that President Nixon may have struck an agreement with the Special Prosecutor's Office so that the extent of any prosecution that might arise out of the Watergate affair could be very limited?
Well, it's my belief that the president, of course, has said that he has considered resignation since Monday evening, and that at least gives him enough time to contact Mr. Jaworski and discuss that possibility. Now, there have been no reports to that effect as of right now. The president hasn't said as to whether or not he's going to get any kind of immunity from criminal prosecution. The president is a lawyer, it should be remembered, and he has said that he has admitted to some poor judgments in the past, although, again, he hasn't admitted to any guilt, criminal guilt. Now, whether we're talking about a fine line, it depends on where the poor judgment occurred and in relation to what. I think that's a key point.
Well, the immediate question now is, what could the special prosecutor use in terms of charges to be brought against him? He certainly cannot use articles of impeachment, or rather the non-specific ideas embodied in the articles of impeachment. He would have to have a much more specific indictment. He certainly also could not charge him with lying to the American public, since, although that is rather immoral, I question whether it is illegal.
Go ahead. Finish up. I'm sorry, I thought you were finished.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to comment that the rapidity of the events, all of this having taken place in a period of approximately 3 days, would seem to rule out that even if anyone mentioned to him the possibility of plea bargaining, or whether he proposed it, whether he was in contact with anyone, I don't know how anyone in his position could have relied on the advices of anybody so significantly to make this decision on that score alone. I just don't think that Mr. Nixon is even that confident about his defenses to think that just because someone said we'll consider some sort of reduced charges that he's going to take their word for it. I think he has his eyes open considerably enough to realize that he faces enormous criminal prosecution should people elect to proceed in that direction.
Also, several civil suits which could arise from the wiretaps and so on, and some of the other involvement in some of the covert activities of the Plumbers Group and others.
Well, the only actual charges, judging by the evidence that has been so far released, and again, we must remember that there is much evidence that has not been released while Judge Sirica decides on the merits of national security.
Indeed, and
while tapes are still being found.
And curious will be the resolution of the rest of the missing tapes, because the fact that the president is no longer the president, he individually, I would not think, can be called to account for the rest of them now, because he's no longer the president. Will Mr. Ford become the custodian of the tapes?
I think so. They're in the custody of the Secret Service. And as such, Mr. Ford would be the custodian.
Yes, I would suppose that's the case. One of the president's motives for resigning, and this does not discuss, of course, the aspect of him declining to admit any guilt in the Watergate cover-up, one of his motives was his financial well-being. It should be noted that if the president was impeached and convicted in the Senate, he would have lost a $60,000 a year pension. He would have lost $96,000 in office staff expenses and free office space for life.
And may still,
Under these conditions, with his resignation coming tomorrow afternoon, he will receive these benefits as of right now.
I think that's a very real issue. The question of, although the president did not carry this fight for his personal vindication, or whatever he wanted to call it, through to the end, and although he has resigned, and therefore any impeachment proceedings would be made moot, and he resigned in full custody of the office of the presidency, I think the question of whether we treat Richard M. Nixon as we would any other ex-president is a very important one. I really wonder as to the propriety of that, and as to really the effect on future generations, and even on the world and the view of the world at this point, if we just allow the president to step down and sort of try to get out of the limelight and just sit back and write his memoirs and collect his pension and so on. I really wonder what the effect would be, and what the meaning of that would be in terms of the principles on which the United States has been based.
Well, I don't really think there could be that much of a question, in that there's very little Congress can actually do. So Congress certainly cannot strip the president of his pension now without it being ex post facto, after the fact, which is specifically outlawed under
Illegal,
the Constitution.
Well, isn't there also the question of this law having been enacted during his time in the presidency? Isn't there a companion measure to that no government official can receive the emoluments of any act to which he is a party as a member of the government? I haven't heard that discussed
Certainly, that's something
yet.
else, and I haven't heard that at all either. It's interesting that you bring that up, Clark. I think one of the things, talking about the rationale behind the resignation, is the fact, and this once again harks back to the president's speech this evening. He dwelt tremendously on foreign policy, and word out of Washington had it that the president still had not, I think to quote Ron Ziegler, changed his position as of late yesterday afternoon or last evening. And of course, he had a late night meeting with Henry Kissinger last night. And of course, this morning, Vice President Ford was summoned to the White House. I wonder if the Secretary of State might have, well, to use the word played upon, the expression played upon, I suppose is a bad word, but whether the president might have been influenced by his concern with history and with his position in history, and whether the Secretary of State might have mentioned that if he was to resign and if he was to take himself out of this political process of impeachment, that his foreign policy accomplishments would still remain intact, and whether he might have felt that his place in the history books was more valuable than his finishing out his term, and therefore he opted for resignation.
Let's face it, when you just a quick one, if you read the bottom line, it's going to say that Richard M. Nixon was not impeached, much less convicted in the Senate, and as the years go by, the various details of his resignation may become more and more obscured, and indeed those foreign policy achievements may be the thing that stick out.
This is very true.
To review, Alan, go right ahead.
Thank you. There's also the question, which Nixon set up very well in his speech, that if he is prosecuted criminally, does this hurt the country? And he said that the reason he was stepping down was because he couldn't get along with Congress, and therefore that was hurting the country. Would prosecuting the president hurt the country? And if so, he has set himself up with the statement that, well, I was doing something for the country. Can't you do something for the country too? Don't prosecute me.
Do something for me because I did so much for you, in other words.
I think to a degree there has been a great deal of sentiment on Capitol Hill that how would it look around the world if the former president, very recently former president of the United States, were dragged before a jury, as a defendant in a criminal proceeding? What would that look like in the eye of world public opinion? And I think that this is one of the things that the president is counting on to a degree. I think also the fact that he did say this evening that he had lost his political base in the Congress kind of leaves the implication that should the Congress make a decision to pursue any sort of impeachment proceedings or something like that, that the public and the president the president might have left a taste in the public mouth, so to speak, that this could be a political vendetta on the part of the democratically controlled Congress to see to it that Richard Nixon didn't get off scot-free, that sort of thing.
Ira, you mentioned a moment ago about the attitudes of foreign countries, and I think it's interesting to note that earlier this week there were reports from Paris and London that Europeans were bewildered as to all the excitement and the fascination that Americans had with the Watergate cover-up. They didn't seem to think it was as significant as the American people made it out to be. I think that that points up a vast difference in attitude and philosophy.
And I think it's something that the American people should really take note of, because the entire Western European community is used to waking up and finding a different government, and not necessarily in countries that are ruled by various military juntas taking over from each other. In Great Britain,
they seem to have a sex scandal every 3 or 4 years.
Whatever the case,
Italy is probably the ultimate example.
And we have prime ministers that come in and out. Harold Wilson is in his second tenure at the moment, and it just happens to be, when
that
the lot
points up one of the uniquenesses of our particular system of government, the fact that that you can't simply remove your chief executive by a simple parliamentary vote of no confidence. I mean, you can't just have a majority of the Congress turn around and say, sorry, Dick, we don't believe in you anymore, and so then the standard bearer of the opposition party takes over.
And there's a case that can be made for that, but by the same token, Western Europe is not in shambles either, although people certainly have enough complaints about the political system.
Well, I think one question that is kind of not being brought up here also is that on the other side, as I said, I feel that Mr. Jaworski holds the key rather than Congress now, since the impeachment question is rather moot. Criminal prosecution is pretty well up to Mr. Jaworski, and I honestly cannot see how Mr. Jaworski can ignore the fact that in this country there will be a great cry for equal justice under the law. There will be people who will say, if Richard Nixon is guilty, he had better be brought before the law. We're going to have plea bargaining up to a point, but this is the president. If the president himself has betrayed the ultimate trust
Alan,
the country can give a man.
Excuse me, our Alan Goldwasser has informed us that Vice President Ford is speaking right now to the President Ford, Vice President as of right now, is speaking to the press, I believe outside the White House. Alan?
I believe it almost sounds like an acceptance speech, but basically Ford is dealing with one topic and one topic alone, world affairs. And in so doing, he has stated that Kissinger will be his Secretary of State. That is about the only thing meaningful he has said. He will just say that he will continue with the building blocks that, quote, as nearly as possible as I can get it, the former administration had set up.
I think that in the past few months, the Nixon administration really on the world front has been almost solely represented, I would say, by Henry Kissinger. It seems as though, aside from the trip to Moscow and the trip through the Middle East, the president hasn't really been dealing that much in the realm of foreign affairs, and even on those trips, it seemed that a good deal of the groundwork had been done in advance by the Secretary of State. And I think that to a degree, this should be reassuring for foreign governments. They'll know that their dealings with the United States will be unimpaired by this unprecedented action of the resignation of a president.
To go through the plans that Mr. Ford has in assuming the presidency, he plans at this point to deliver a brief speech to the American people, calling on the nation to unite behind him, praising the courage of the president for stepping down and asking everyone to put the crisis needs of the country first. This Henry Kissinger situation is, of course, supported by the statement that he will ask all cabinet members and key aides to stay on, with special emphasis on Secretary of State Kissinger, whose public popularity is recognized as a source of particular strength for a new administration and the president. So it would seem that Henry Kissinger is very important to the new Ford administration. We are beginning to receive now some reaction to the president's resignation. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio said he welcomed Nixon's resignation. He added that I regret that it leaves unanswered many questions that could have been resolved through the constitutional process. So it would, I would assume that Senator Taft would have wanted the process to go through. Illinois GOP Senator Charles Percy, who was mentioned as one of the possibilities for a Ford vice presidency, the president has made the right decision, Senator Percy said, right for the country, right for his family, and right for himself. So that, at this point, is the extent of the reaction to the president's statements. And I think a White House aide says that President Nixon and his family will say farewell to the White House staff tomorrow morning and fly to San Clemente, California, before Gerald Ford is sworn in to succeed him. In the words of the aide, Nixon wants to leave the White House while he is still president. Nixon will not attend the swearing-in of Ford, expected to take place at noon in the East Room of the White House. And by the time Nixon arrives in his San Clemente home, he will be a private citizen. More reaction is beginning to arrive. Secretary of Commerce Frederick Dent said this evening, quote, "My sympathy for President and Mrs. Nixon is tempered by the realization that history will generously recognize the positive achievement of his presidency and his sincere effort for a generation of peace."
Of course, the word is in now that John Ehrlichman won't comment on the president's speech this evening till Monday. He's going away for a long weekend. That just in. Conspicuous absence, I would say. Ehrlichman, of course, having been sentenced to a minimum of 20 months in prison for his part in the burglary of Dr. Lewis Fielding, psychiatrist of Daniel Ellsberg.
I don't know, maybe I'm a delinquent here, but I did not hear any word after the president's statement of the other day that he withheld information from his lawyer and from the public. There wasn't any mention of a comment from Bob Haldeman. I don't believe there was any. Was there, Clark?
I don't recall reaction from Haldeman either, but as even their once mutual lawyer was want to get them confused, I think we could expect a similar no comment from him, as he is in a similar position to Mr. Ehrlichman at the present.
We're beginning to get word on Vice President Ford's comments of the evening following the president's speech. Vice President Ford says he thinks the president has made one of the greatest personal sacrifices for the country and one of the greatest decisions on behalf of all Americans by his decision to resign. The Vice President went on to announce that Secretary of State Kissinger has agreed now to remain on as Secretary of State when he, Ford, becomes president. And I think that probably came from the 2-hour conversation that Vice President Ford had with Secretary of State Kissinger this afternoon. They were discussing foreign policy, and that probably did come up as far as accepting to continue as Secretary of State. Word from overseas, the official TASS news agency reported in 2 sentences the resignation of President Nixon. The Washington report headlined, "Richard Nixon Resigns," and sent on the TASS newswire 2 minutes after the president announced his decision said as follows. Addressing the nation on radio and television on Thursday, U.S. President Richard Nixon announced his resignation. Quoting, "Under the Constitution of the United States, Vice President Gerald Ford will take over as president." And I think that follows the philosophy of the Soviets in keeping announcements of this sort and other news from the United States very brief.
It's interesting that we're now entering on an era which is, of course, after this unprecedented action of a president resigning in the middle of his term, due to some rather earlier unusual circumstances, that, of course, being the plea of Vice President Agnew, the no contest plea on the charge of tax evasion, and the dismissal of the Vice President. We're entering now, the next couple of years, we will be, our country will be headed, actually, we'll have a chief executive and a man a heartbeat away from the chief executive's chair. both of whom will not have been elected by the people. We're entering into an era when the executive branch will be headed by two appointed representatives. Of course, Gerald Ford appointed by Richard Nixon to the vice presidency, and then assuming the presidency on Nixon's resignation, and of course Ford will appoint a vice president. And
there are a number of people, I think, who have great issue with the fact that the American presidency is even filled by a democratic process anyway, though, in that the field is narrowed to two out of the many millions by virtue of the political conventions, and of course, compromised as it has been over the years, the fact that it is not a direct popular vote that elects the president, so that in reality, although that is true, that we do not have popularly elected president or vice president as of noon tomorrow. How much of a departure will that actually be?
An interesting thing is the fact that when this amendment was being considered, there were those people who said, what if the vice president should have to resign for one reason or another, and another one be appointed, and then what if the president should fall ill and the vice president should ascend to the presidency and have to appoint a vice president? And at the time everyone said, well, the odds of that happening are so minuscule that the idea of even thinking of that is ridiculous. And of course, here we are in a situation just a few years later where we certainly are in a situation that the odds were minuscule, but August 8th, 1974, and here we are.
I believe with Ford now coming into the role, assuming the presidency, it brings about a screw into the Republican machine in 1976. He becomes the leading candidate, of course, for the Republican nomination for president. But deciding on who will be the vice president is a political question that Ford is going to have to make, because Nelson Rockefeller, wanting to take the presidency, shot in 1976. If he chooses Rockefeller, they become two candidates against themselves for the presidency in 1976, in which case there could be friction between the two of them.
Except I think if someone like Nelson Rockefeller or Charles Percy is the choice of Mr. Ford to be vice president, I think that is the signal that Gerald Ford does not intend to seek election to the office in 1976. He is choosing someone.
Almost.
Yes, he is in effect picking an incumbent, and as we've already heard people speculate that he's going to try to run the White House in more of a compartmentalized and departmentalized fashion. Presumably that will carry significant responsibility to the vice president, and he will be a visible person.
But Clark, who does he choose? Does he choose the best man for the job, or someone that he feels he could beat for the presidential election in 1976?
I think it'll be apparent which he's decided by that person, I think, is going to be the story.
Well, there is also the question with former Governor Rockefeller, to the effect of his age. He will be 68 years old in 1976, and it is questionable whether he will be able to be a candidate at that age, a viable candidate anyway.
As far as the vice president for the soon-to-be President Ford, there was speculation that perhaps Nelson Rockefeller would be considered, but just recently we got a listing of possibilities from a White House source that did not mention Nelson Rockefeller. And as I said before, the reason being that it may be felt that Mr. Rockefeller is a little bit too liberal for some conservative Republicans, and therefore would be unsuitable to Mr. Ford.
It's really an incredibly wide range in the political spectrum of that list that was circulated earlier today. If one would call Rockefeller liberal, the mere mention of Edward Brooks' name on that list is almost astounding, and I think if perchance, actually it hasn't even seriously been discussed that Brooke would be a candidate, because here we'd have about the third precedent in 24 hours if we had a black man appointed to the position of vice president. So that I think that also would be something of a sign of Ford's continuing interest in the presidency beyond 1976 if we had someone like that appointed also.
Looking to the future, I think that one of the things, well, we can look at the future and almost see a mirror in the past. Of course, when John F. Kennedy was killed and Lyndon Johnson succeeded him as president, a great many of Kennedy's legislative proposals and so on had been stalled in the Congress because of the fact that Kennedy had made a great many enemies in the Congress. And, of course, he was succeeded by Lyndon Johnson, a man who had a good deal of clout on Capitol Hill, and who was able to take many of these programs and bring them through, collecting on old debts or in whatever manner. And I think that Richard Nixon, in the closing days of his presidency, has his ability to deal with the Congress has been certainly impaired, and especially some of the earlier actions that he had taken, the impoundment of funds and some of the things that were mentioned during the Public Judiciary Committee hearings, had made many enemies, especially on the Democratic side of the aisle, and even some among the Republicans. And Gerald Ford, of course, being a longtime strong man of the Republican Party on Capitol Hill, might now be in a position to come through on the domestic front in a way that Richard Nixon was unable to. And, of course, Nixon capitalized on his foreign policy. Now, Ford will maintain Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State, which would indicate that we will continue to have an active foreign policy, and we might just see, in conjunction with that, an even more active domestic policy under Gerald Ford than we had seen under Richard Nixon.
Well, a few moments ago, Senator Cranston of Rhode Island was asked to comment on Ford's success in Congress, and he said Ford knows the members of Congress right now. He's fresh out of Congress. He should be able to work well with that situation.
Here is a statement that Vice President Ford has just recently made, which sort of agrees with what's just been said. Mr. Ford says he does not think he's made an enemy in politics and believes that beginning tomorrow he can work with Democrats as well as Republicans in solving the problems of the nation.
Well, the only question I have with regards to Ira's simile between Vice President Johnson and Vice President Ford is that Johnson was the former Senate Majority Leader, Ford is the former Senate Minority Leader.
Which he inherited from the late Everett Dirksen.
Right. Well, the point that I'm making is that he will have to have the cooperation of the Democratic leaders, which President Johnson was assured. President Ford may not be assured of that.
Of course, Ford is only the second president in I guess almost 100 years that has ascended to office with both houses of Congress controlled by the opposition party. The first, of course, was Richard Nixon, from whom he's inheriting the Congress. And this could be a problem, but generally Gerald Ford was well-liked, especially by his colleagues on both sides of the aisle from the Midwest. And his moderate conservatism had a degree of appeal to Democrats from the South. So it is quite possible that Ford might be able to forge a coalition on Capitol Hill that could enable him to bring forward the domestic programs which Richard Nixon has had stalled.
Well, before we really inaugurate Mr. Ford yet, I think the actual event of the evening, of course, was Mr. Nixon's statement, and I think it is notable that if you cut out a few words of it, it would be indistinguishable from any speech he's made over the past 5.5 years, talking in generalities, not talking, and especially when he had an issue here tonight to talk about, that of Watergate, he did not address himself to it once again. And rather than perhaps any plea bargaining having taken place, I believe that Mr. Nixon has decided to get out swiftly will be his best course, and hope that in the flood of goodwill that will follow it, that he will somehow escape what could very well befall him otherwise.
And if he does escape such a thing, everyone wrote Richard Nixon off after the tremendous defeat at the hands of John F. Kennedy. Well, not tremendous defeat, but after the defeat at the hands of John F. Kennedy in 1960. People generally wrote Richard Nixon off.
The mind boggles at what you're about to say.
At his future being finished, and a listener called in to raise the question of whether the president might actually be eligible in 1980, since he has not yet completed 2 full terms of office.
I'd have to say he wouldn't be eligible for dog catcher in 1980. I don't think he could get elected to that position.
There's a difference between eligibility and actually
being elected.
Well, no, but it's hard to tell. As people have said, they wrote Richard Nixon off. They attended his political funeral in 1960. They did it again in California in 62 when he wrote his own epitaph. You won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore.
Well,
and here he was in 1968 taking the presidential position, coming back, winning by a landslide in 72, by the biggest landslide we'd ever seen, and now here he is in 74, having resigned, not having completed the 2 full terms, which would make him ineligible for office once again.
I kind of doubt whether the president would be acceptable to the Republican leadership again in the future He won the nomination in 1968 by getting a lot of political debts from a lot of people. Now I think he's rather in debt
That
to a
could
lot of
very well
Republicans,
be.
and I don't think they're about to let him
Figuratively
put himself in
and
it.
literally.
Yes, he's not about to put himself in a position. They're not about to put themselves in a position where Mr. Nixon can manipulate the situation once more.
It's an interesting thought, though.
Let's turn our attention now back to Mr. Ford, soon to be 38th President of the United States. His foreign policy, I don't know, the aspects of foreign policy are not a strength with Mr. Ford. I have the feeling that he's going to need a tremendous amount of support from Secretary Kissinger. Maybe Mr. Reinert has some comments on that.
Gee, Mike, I didn't know you knew I was here tonight.
Yes, you haven't introduced him yet.
I know he broke in. Kevin Reinert has joined us, as you were probably aware by
Sometime
now. You really can't miss him. And
Dan Rather Jr. over there.
you can continue on your comment, Kevin.
Which comment was that, Mike?
I was discussing Mr.
Senator.
Maybe I can turn this question to Alan Goldwasser. Alan, what do you think about the Vice President's strength right now as far as foreign policy is concerned?
Well, apparently foreign policy is the only place he wanted to deal with because that's all he did in his speech. Nixon, when he was giving his speech, almost looked like knew he was going to resign because he said, I picked Ford for president because I knew that in Ford the country would be in good hands. So apparently Nixon may have had some idea at some time that he would have to resign because when he did pick Ford, he felt anyway that with the help of Congress, since he does get along with Congress, no matter what topic it would be in, he would get along. It could be that Congress will now be running the country because of Ford's close allegiance with them.
Now, you're speaking about the domestic side, getting along
Both
with Congress
sides.
and
I
domestic
think-
policy. What I'm talking about specifically is foreign policy.
You know, Mike,
With foreign policy, they will let Henry Kissinger run the show.
very much as was done before. This is WBAU in Garden City, by the way. A very important point that Alan touched on, I think, is the fact that over a period of time, you can detect trends in the way that a government works, and of course in the history of the United States in recent years, we've seen a trend toward a very, very strong presidency. And that, I suppose, reached its apex with the administration of Richard Nixon. I think that what we're entering into now is a period of history where just this week we had the judiciary branch assert that reassert the doctrine of Marbury versus Madison, that the courts shall rule what the law is. And we've had the Congress asserting its authority over the executive branch. And I think that we're entering into a period of time where that separation of powers, as the founding fathers envisioned it, might be working very well, with the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive branches all working together. And I think that we have seen to a degree, although Richard Nixon insisted that he did not want to do anything that would have any effect on hog-tying or limiting the power of the presidency, I think that in fact, and it might just be a trend of history, but I think that Richard Nixon was the president during the last administration for a long time that we will see where we had such a very strong executive branch.
Okay, quickly recapping, Richard M. Nixon resigned tonight, although he said it is, as he put it, abhorrent to every instinct in my body. He said he has decided to resign and relinquish the presidency of the United States to Vice President Gerald Ford because he no longer has the support of the Congress. In a 16-minute broadcast, Nixon said that he normally would have felt it his duty to complete his term and continue the work he has started. But because of the threat of impeachment, he said, quote, I no longer have enough political power and strength in Congress to justify continuing that effort. In a brief reference to Watergate, Nixon said, quote, if some of my judgments were wrong, and some were, I believe they were made in the best interests of this nation.
One very last reaction, Senator Edward Kennedy, sounding very much like he is in the running, although he hasn't actually said that he is, for the Democratic nomination, has said that the resignation is clearly in the best interest of the nation. And Kennedy's words were, "I am sure that Congress and the country will close ranks behind President Ford as America enters a period of national healing and reconciliation. Let all of us join together in rebuilding confidence and trust in our system of government. The night of Watergate is over, the Constitution is safe, and America can become whole again." Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, sounding like he has begun his run for...
Sounding like a Kennedy.
Yes, a Kennedy and a candidate.
Okay, I think that just about does it. You have been listening to a WBAU News special report. Along with me this evening has been Alan Goldwasser, Clark Howard, Ira Sitzer, Ira Salwin, Joanne Ventura, Kevin Reinert. I'm Mike Kane. Bruce James is next with 3 hours of rock till 1 o'clock. Good night.
WBAU Garden City.